Greetings everyone and welcome back to another episode of Bite Size History. I will be your host, Audrey Durham, and in today's episode we are going to be looking at how historians interpret history and how to write a historical research paper. Alright, there's a lot involved in that, so let's get started. Before we get started in our lesson, we need to take a quick look at our benchmark, or standard one, which is utilize historical thinking skills and analytical processes, as well as our learning goals and our learning targets for today. Now, our learning goals are a little broad for today. First one is view historic events through the eyes of those who were there, as shown in their art, writings, music, and artifacts. Now, this is basically just an overview of what we'll be doing in this lesson, and as we go through the series, you'll actually be able to understand this concept a little bit more. Our next learning goal is to describe the roles of historians and recognize varying historical interpretations. We'll be able to do that by the end of this lesson. Now, our learning targets are going to be, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to draw conclusions from context and explain how to contextualize objects. Now that means looking at primary sources, whether they be physical or written, primary sources in order to better understand what you're trying to learn from that source. Now, our next learning target is you should be able to explain how bias and point of view can alter the perception and research documentation of historical events. Now, this is a big one, and it goes right into that drawing conclusions about different types of objects and research strategies. Let's go ahead and get into our lesson about learning how history is studied by historians and how to write a historical research paper. Okay, so the four historical thinking skills are used by historians and archaeologists as well as other sciences that study history. And first off, we have crafting historical arguments from historical evidence. Now, this means being able to develop a question about the past and to address that question through the building of an argument. In order for an argument to be reasonable, it must also be plausible and supported by historical evidence. Argumentation is one of the core historical thinking skills and is often utilized in research papers. Our second historical thinking skill is chronological reasoning. This relates to the ability to analyze, identify, and evaluate events related to each other. And an example of this would actually be explaining the cause, course, and consequence of the American Revolution. This involves understanding why the colonists rebelled against Great Britain, and then also why Great Britain chose to tax the colonists without providing them with representation in Parliament. Now, through the chronological sequences of events, we can actually see some of the underlying causes of the American Revolution. And that's how we determine how events are either through correlation or by cause and effect related to each other. Third, we have comparison and contextualization. This is the ability to compare, evaluate, and describe several different historical events and developments within one society or civilization, and see how they are related to each other. And finally, number 4 for our historical thinking skills is historical interpretation and synthesis. Being able to develop a variety of interpretations about the past through the utilization of primary and secondary sources through reason, differing points of view, potential bias, and context and points of reference in the research. So this is how the historical interpretations are actually developed. Historians interpret information as they research and analyze documents and other forms of evidence. Historical books and articles are checked for accuracy by experts or scholars in that respective field. First up, we have the question of what is bias and how can it impact historical research. Now, we discussed bias a little bit in our past episode. However, we're going to discuss point of view and bias because they are very similar. Now, a point of view is a person's personal attitude about life or people, and bias is an unreasoned emotional judgment about people or events. Modern bias can be altered or indicative of modern values being placed on a historical event or societal norms. When looking at potential sources for research, it's really important to check that these documents were not written with a modern bias. This point of view can change how the writer portrays the information. Now, as a writer, you will also need to monitor your bias or point of view when looking through evidence so you can see it for the time period it is, that it's from versus overlaying modern opinions or judgments about the people involved. For example, an animal rights person discussing the Battle of Hannibal crossing the Alps with the elephants as a battle strategy might overlay their feelings or opinions about the cruelty to animals taking place rather than the battle strategy and the mental attitude during the time period. Now, this could be extreme. However, it's again just very important to make sure that you are not overlaying your personal beliefs onto something that is from a past historical event. Those people didn't develop the way we've developed. And it's important to recognize that and look at the time period for what it was, not what we think it should have been or could have been. Another aspect of writing research papers and books is the perspective you might take for interpreting the evidence. Now, this does not necessarily have to do with bias or your point of view. However, point of view sometimes can be used in an argumentative manner. Researchers use evidence to draw conclusions about their topics based on their reasoning of the evidence or facts involved. Some historians may disagree about the interpretation of evidence and conclusions presented by another historian doing the exact same research as they are. Remember that the same person in history could be seen as a villain or a hero based on these interpretations. If you're writing a research paper, it's important to make sure that your topic is not so broad that your paper is too long and that you can make specific points. Now, especially research papers for academics, now this could be high school or college, there are usually set lengths for these papers, so you want to make sure that you can fit all of the information you're looking for into whatever the criteria is that's required of you. You should have a theory or argument of some type about the content you are researching in order to make the paper more engaging. And this means that if you think the transition from coin to paper currency brought about the downfall of society, then you should be able to pinpoint the eras in which this happened and the events that followed. Also, you will need to use articles that may support as well as refute your argument, and as much primary source evidence as you can find. Now, primary sources will be less likely to have bias outside of what you might apply to them, and that's really important in your research because in order to find the primary sources, they're just giving you what's written down at that time. And there could be bias based on the writer from that time period. And that's another way that we have to look at multiple varieties of primary sources as well as secondary sources in order to make sure that we are getting the full story for history. Now, when you are writing any style of research paper, you need to make sure that you're watching out for plagiarism. Plagiarism is when you portray the words or thoughts of someone else as your own without giving credit to your source. I'm utilizing a combination of textbooks, internet articles, personal knowledge I've gained over the years from both studying and teaching history, as well as other research books and videos to create the content for my channel. My hope is that through combining information and breaking it down a bit more into my own words, this content will hopefully be easier for others to understand as they are learning these concepts. I am also doing my best not to violate any copyright laws while I'm at it, which is another form of plagiarism. Now then, with all that being said, it can be incredibly fun to write research papers about topics that interest you. Finding certain eras of history that you can research and learn more about is a great way to learn history more in depth. In our next episode, we will be discussing geography, another key concept to understanding history and why people may have actually settled in the different locations that they did, as well as just being able to read a map when researching history projects or learning about a new culture. If you enjoyed this channel, please make sure that you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, Bite Size History with Audrey Durham. If you would like to utilize some of my planning notes, activities, or lesson plans that go along with these videos, I will have a Patreon account up very soon. Please keep an eye out for it. I'll let you guys know either through my Instagram, through YouTube, or through my Facebook page. Until then, thank you all for joining me for another episode of Bite Size History. Have a great day, everybody.